December 1942, the Stalingrad front. Katerina Volkov stands in the assembly trench, her breath crystallizing into ice before it even leaves her lips. The thermometer reads 38 degrees Celsius, but the wind makes it feel like the air itself is made of knives. She's 22 years old, a machine gunner with the 284th Rifle Division, and right now, every man in her unit is staring at her PPSH-41 like she's lost her mind. "You ruined it," Senior Sergeant Dmitry Petrov says, shaking his head. The stocky Ukrainian points at her submachine gun with his own pristine PPSH. "That's military property, Volkov. They could court-martial you for defacing your weapon." Katerina looks down at her modification. Where the standard metal trigger guard should be, that curved steel piece every PPSH-41 has protecting the trigger, she's wrapped thick leather padding, creating an enlarged, insulated guard nearly twice the size of regulation. She spent 3 nights in the dugout, carving it from a German officer's boot she'd stripped from a corpse, stitching it with wire, padding it with felt from a destroyed Ushanka hat. "It looks insane," another soldier mutters, "like something a child would make." "The Fritzes will laugh themselves to death when they see it," Petrov continues, loading his drum magazine, "before they shoot you." But Katerina isn't listening anymore. She's watching Petrov's hands, watching how he has to strip off his heavy winter mittens entirely to grip his weapon, leaving his fingers exposed to air, so cold it can cause frostbite in less than 5 minutes. She's watching how his fingers are already turning white at the tips, how he fumbles with the magazine, how his trigger finger trembles as he tries to warm it against his palm. She's seen this movie before. 3 days ago, Private Yuri Sokolov lost 2 fingers to frostbite after a firefight that lasted 20 minutes. The field surgeon had to amputate with a bayonet and no anesthesia. Sokolov's screams still echo in her nightmares. "You'll see," she says quietly, cinching her modified guard tighter. Her thick winter glove fits perfectly inside the enlarged space, her fingers still able to reach the trigger while staying insulated. "When the shooting starts, you'll see," Petrov laughs, a harsh, bitter sound. "When the shooting starts, Volkov, you'll be fumbling with that ridiculous thing while the rest of us are already dropping Germans. Mark my words." The whistle blows. The attack begins. And Katerina Volkov is about to prove everyone wrong, or die trying. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what winter meant on the Eastern Front. This wasn't cold like you've experienced. This wasn't wear a heavy coat and you'll be fine. Cold. Temperatures regularly plummeted below 40 degrees Celsius, the point where Celsius and Fahrenheit converge, where exposed skin freezes in minutes, where metal becomes an enemy that adheres to flesh and tears it away. Wehrmacht soldiers called it General Winter, the invisible enemy that killed more efficiently than bullets. But here's what German propaganda never told you. Soviet soldiers were dying too, in droves. Not from German fire, but from their own weapons. The PPSH-41 was a marvel of Soviet engineering. Simple, reliable, produced by the millions. Designer Georgy Shpagin had created a submachine gun that could be manufactured in any metalworking shop, that fired 900 rounds per minute, that soldiers called the burp gun for its distinctive sound. Over 5 million were produced during the war. It saved the Soviet Union. But Shpagin had designed it in a Moscow workshop, tested in moderate conditions. Nobody had properly field tested it in true Siberian winter conditions. Nobody had anticipated what would happen when you gave millions of these weapons to soldiers fighting in the coldest winter Europe had seen in 140 years. The problem was elegantly simple and devastatingly deadly. The trigger guard was solid metal. Standard military doctrine said soldiers should wear thick winter gloves, heavy mittens that kept their hands warm enough to function. But those same gloves couldn't fit inside the narrow metal trigger guard of the PPSH-41. The opening was designed for a bare finger, or at most, a thin summer glove. So soldiers had two choices, both fatal. Keep your gloves on and be unable to fire your weapon, or strip them off to shoot and lose your fingers to frostbite within minutes. We called it the Devil's Choice, recalled Sergeant Mikhail Andreev in his post-war memoir. Your fingers or your life. Most men chose their fingers. They would strip their gloves, fire their weapon, then desperately try to warm their hands in their armpits before the flesh froze solid. I saw men weeping from the pain, their fingertips black with frostbite, still firing because the Germans kept coming. The Soviet High Command knew about the problem. Field reports from the Winter War with Finland in 1939-1940 had documented it. Engineers had proposed solutions: enlarged trigger guards, insulated guards, even redesigning the weapon entirely. But this was 1942. The Soviet Union was losing. Factories were being evacuated east ahead of German advances. Production quotas mattered more than soldier comfort. Make them faster, not better, was the unspoken rule. Modifications would slow production. Soldiers would have to adapt, and adapt they did, but not how commanders expected. Katerina Volkov had grown up in Kirov, northeast of Moscow, where winter temperatures regularly hit 45-degree Celsius. Her father was a leather worker, her mother a seamstress. From childhood, she understood materials, understood how cold worked, understood the difference between surviving winter and enduring it. When she volunteered for military service in June 1942, after learning her two brothers had been killed at Sevastopol, they sent her to the Central Women's Sniper School. But Katerina couldn't sit still with a sniper rifle. She requested transfer to infantry, to assault units, to places where she could move, could fight up close, could see the enemy fall. They gave her a PPSH-41 and sent her west. The first winter patrol, she watched male soldiers struggle. She watched them strip their gloves, fire 3-round bursts, then huddle, trying to restore circulation. She watched fingers turn white, then blue, then black. She watched the field surgeon shake his head and reach for his amputation tools. That night, in the dugout, she began experimenting. She tried cloth wrapping. It helped, but compressed under pressure, offered no structural support. She tried wood, too rigid, broke in the cold. She tried multiple layers of wool, absorbed moisture, froze solid like armor. Then she remembered her father's workshop. Thick leather, properly treated, didn't freeze rigid. It maintained flexibility even in extreme cold. Layered with felt for insulation, secured with wire stitching that wouldn't snap in the cold, it could create a protective barrier that still allowed trigger access. She worked for 3 nights, using a German officer's boot she'd stripped from a corpse after a skirmish. The leather was high quality. German officers had better equipment than their own soldiers, let alone Soviet infantrymen. She carved it carefully, stitched it with scavenged wire, padded it with felt from a destroyed hat. The result looked absurd. The trigger guard was nearly double its original size, wrapped in crude leather like a child's craft project. It didn't match the clean lines of the weapon. It violated every aesthetic principle of Soviet military equipment. When she showed up to formation with it, the mockery was immediate and merciless. Volkov's playing dress-up with her weapon. Did your mother sew that for you? The Germans will laugh so hard they'll forget to shoot. Even her squad leader, Petrov, couldn't hide his disdain. This isn't a fashion show, Volkov. This is war. Your weapon needs to be standard, reliable regulation. It is reliable, she replied quietly. More reliable than frostbitten fingers. You'll see how reliable it is when you need it, Petrov shot back. when you're fumbling with that ridiculous leather mitten while the rest of us have already engaged the enemy. The whistle blew for the attack, and Katerina's moment of vindication or failure had arrived. The assault began at 0500 hours, in darkness so complete that soldiers moved by sound and instinct. The 284th Rifle Division's objective was a German fortified position overlooking the Volga River, a cluster of bunkers and machine gun nests that had pinned down Soviet forces for 11 days. Intelligence said a weak point existed on the northern approach. Intelligence was often wrong, but orders were orders. Katerina moved with her squad through the snow, which came up past her knees. The cold was beyond description, not just cold, but aggressive, predatory, seeking any exposed flesh to destroy. Her breath formed ice crystals on her scarf. Her eyelashes frosted over. Every step required conscious effort, pushing through snow that grabbed at your boots like skeletal hands. The PPSH-41 hung across her chest, its 71-round drum magazine loaded, a spare drum secured to her belt. Through her thick winter glove, she could feel the leather padding on her modified trigger guard, warm, flexible, ready. Around her, other soldiers struggled with their weapons. She watched Corporal Andrei Kuzmin strip off his right mitten as they advanced, tucking it into his belt. His hand was immediately exposed to 38 cold degrees air. He would have maybe 15 minutes before frostbite set in, less if they got into sustained combat. The German machine gun opened fire when they were 80 meters out. The MG-42's distinctive sound, Hitler's buzzsaw they called it, capable of firing 100 to 200 rounds per minute, ripped through the pre-dawn darkness. Tracer rounds drew orange lines through the blackness. Men screamed. The Soviet advance faltered. Down! Down! Return fire! Petrov was shouting, dropping into the snow. This was the moment, the critical seconds where fire superiority meant survival. Katerina didn't hesitate, didn't strip off gloves, didn't fumble with cold metal. Her insulated glove slipped perfectly into the enlarged leather trigger guard, her finger finding the trigger immediately, naturally, while maintaining full protection from the cold. She brought the PPSH-41 up and fired. The weapon bucked against her shoulder. That familiar burst, 5 rounds, 6 rounds, short controlled bursts like training taught. She swept left, catching movement near the German position, fired again. The drum magazine held 71 rounds. She had plenty. Around her, chaos. Corporal Kuzmin was fumbling with his own PPSH, trying to get his rapidly numbing finger around the trigger. The metal guard was already coated with frost from his breath. His finger slipped again. I can't. My hand. Private Leonid Sokolov had managed to fire 3 bursts, but his exposed hand was already trembling violently. He was trying to warm it in his armpit while still holding his weapon. An impossible task. Sergeant Petrov had stripped both gloves off entirely, was firing aggressively, effectively, but Katerina could see even in the muzzle flashes that his fingers were turning white. He had maybe minutes before frostbite became irreversible, but Katerina kept firing. Smooth, controlled, uninterrupted. Her hands stayed warm. Her finger maintained sensitivity and dexterity. She could feel the trigger's resistance, could control her burst length, could aim accurately instead of just spraying and praying. The German MG-42 shifted toward her position. The enemy had identified her as a threat. Snow exploded around her as bullets tore through the ground. She rolled. Left came up firing, caught the muzzle flash of the German position, put a sustained burst directly into it. The MG-42 went silent. That's it. That's it. Move up. Petrov was screaming, but his voice was slurred. He was trying to reload his PPSH, but his fingers wouldn't cooperate. The drum magazine fell from his frozen hands. He stared at it, lying in the snow, as if unable to comprehend what had happened. Katerina was already moving forward, weapon up, firing short bursts at enemy positions. 2 German soldiers emerged from a bunker, rifles raised. She cut them down before they could aim, her hand steady, her finger responsive. Behind her, Kuzmin was crying, not from fear, but from the burning agony of frostbite setting into his right hand. He'd gotten off maybe 20 rounds before his fingers seized up. Now he couldn't even hold his weapon properly. The assault lasted 43 minutes. By the time the German position was overrun, the casualty count was devastating, but not from what you'd expect. Of the 37 Soviet soldiers who participated in the attack, 14 were wounded by German fire. But 22 suffered frostbite injuries to their hands, injuries that would result in 7 amputations, 11 cases of permanent nerve damage, and 4 deaths from gangrene over the following weeks. Katerina Volkov was the only soldier who emerged with fully functional hands. In the captured German bunker, as medics worked on the frostbite casualties, Sergeant Petrov sat with both hands wrapped in bandages. The field surgeon had already told him 3 fingers on his right hand would have to come off, maybe the whole hand, depending on how the tissue responded. He looked at Katerina, at her weapon, at the crude leather modification that now looked like the most sophisticated piece of equipment in the Soviet army. "You tried to tell us," he said quietly. His voice was hollow, destroyed. "We mocked you." Katerina said nothing. What was there to say? "How many rounds did you fire?" he asked. "Both drums. 142 rounds. I got off maybe 40 before my hands." He looked down at his bandaged fingers. 40 rounds before my body betrayed me. Lieutenant Volkov, she would receive a field promotion 3 hours later, carefully removed her leather-wrapped trigger guard, studying it in the dim bunker light. It was crude. It was improvised. It was ugly. It was genius. "It's not just the leather," she explained, her voice quiet but firm. "It's understanding the problem. The weapon was designed in a workshop. We're fighting in hell. We have to adapt the weapon to the environment, not adapt ourselves to the weapon." Word spread through the division like wildfire. By evening, 12 soldiers had approached Katerina asking about her modification. By the next day, 37. Within a week, nearly every PPSH-41 gunner in the 284th Rifle Division was attempting some version of her leather, trigger guard wrapping. Not all were successful. Proper leather was scarce, and the technique required precision, but enough worked that the casualty rates from frostbite dropped dramatically. Soldiers who previously couldn't fight for more than minutes in extreme cold could now operate for extended engagements. The divisional commander, Colonel Grigory Tarasov, summoned Katerina to headquarters. She expected a reprimand for defacing military property. Instead, he asked her to write a detailed report on her modification technique. "The Stavka won't authorize redesigning the PPSH-41, he explained. "Production quotas, strategic priorities, all the usual excuses, but we can authorize field modifications. Your method, crude as it looks, could save thousands of hands. Thousands of soldiers who can keep fighting instead of being shipped to field hospitals." Her report was distributed to frontline units across the Stalingrad sector. Some commanders dismissed it as unserious. Others recognized it for what it was: a soldier's innovation born from necessity, from watching comrades suffer, from refusing to accept that the tools of war couldn't be improved by those who used them. Katerina Volkov would survive the war. She would fight through the Battle of Kursk, the liberation of Ukraine, the final push into Germany. She would be wounded twice, decorated 3 times, and never, not once, suffer frostbite to her hands. Her modified PPSH-41, that ridiculous leather-wrapped trigger guard that her comrades had mocked in December 1942, would be preserved after the war in the Central Museum of the Armed Forces in Moscow. Not as a curiosity, not as a joke, but as evidence of what innovation looks like when it comes from the front lines, when it's born from necessity rather than theory, when someone refuses to accept that this is how it's always been done is sufficient reason not to try something new. The story of Katerina Volkov's modified PPSH-41 trigger guard is more than just a tale of one soldier's ingenuity. It's a window into a brutal reality of the Eastern Front that rarely makes it into history books. The war against cold was as deadly as the war against Germany. Soviet records show that during the winter of 1941-1942 alone, over 100,000 Red Army soldiers were hospitalized for frostbite. Not wounded in combat, frozen by their environment. The winter of 1942-1943 added another 90,000. These weren't men who wandered into blizzards unprepared. These were soldiers wearing regulation winter gear, following proper protocols, and still being destroyed by temperatures their equipment wasn't designed for. The PPSH-41 trigger guard problem was just one symptom of a larger issue. Modern warfare had outpaced equipment design. Weapons were being mass-produced based on specifications developed in moderate climates, then distributed to soldiers fighting in the coldest environments on Earth. German forces faced similar challenges. The Wehrmacht's MP-40 submachine gun had an equally problematic metal trigger guard. Their solution was different, but equally desperate. Soldiers began filing down their trigger guards, removing material to create larger openings. This weakened the weapon's structure, but allowed thick gloves to fit. Other German soldiers wrapped their triggers in cloth torn from uniforms, creating insulation that often froze solid and jammed the weapon entirely. But here's what makes Katerina's story remarkable. She wasn't an engineer. She wasn't a weapons designer. She was a 22-year-old leatherworker's daughter from Kirov who saw a problem and solved it with materials at hand. No bureaucratic approval, no engineering committee, just observation, experimentation, and the courage to look crazy if it meant keeping her fingers. After the war, Soviet weapons designers did eventually address the issue, but not how you'd expect. The 1947 AK-47, designed by Mikhail Kalashnikov, featured a trigger guard that could be unlatched and swung down, creating an enlarged opening for winter gloves. Look at any AK variant today, and you'll see that design, a legacy of soldiers like Katerina who fought and suffered while their equipment failed them. Katerina herself rarely spoke about her modification after the war. In a 1967 interview for a Soviet documentary, she was asked what she was most proud of during her military service. "Not the modification," she replied. "I'm proud I came home with all my fingers." The interviewer laughed, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. Of the soldiers in her original squad, the ones who mocked her in December 1942, only 2 survived the war with fully functional hands. Sergeant Petrov lost 3 fingers to frostbite on that December morning, then lost his life at Kursk 6 months later. Corporal Kuzmin lost his entire right hand and was invalided out of service. Private Sokolov survived with moderate frostbite damage, but suffered chronic pain for the rest of his life. Katerina Volkov lived until 1998. She worked as a schoolteacher in Kirov, rarely discussed the war, and kept her modified PPSH-41's leather trigger guard, the actual piece she'd carved from a German officer's boot, in a drawer in her apartment. When she donated it to the museum in 1985, she included a note. "This ugly piece of leather saved my hands and probably my life. I hope nobody ever has to make something like this again. But if they do, if soldiers ever again find themselves fighting with tools that weren't designed for the conditions they face, I hope they remember, regulations don't win wars, adaptability does. Modern relevance." Today, military equipment undergoes extreme environment testing before deployment. Arctic warfare gear includes trigger guards designed specifically for thick gloves. Weapon systems are tested at 50 degrees Celsius to ensure functionality. Engineers consult with frontline soldiers during the design phase, not after. But these protocols exist because of soldiers like Katerina Volkov, people who paid in frozen flesh and amputated fingers for lessons that should have been learned in laboratories. The next time you see a simple piece of military equipment, remember, every design feature, every modification, every seemingly minor detail probably exists because someone, somewhere, suffered without it. The enlarged trigger guard on modern assault rifles isn't a random feature. It's a memorial, carved in metal and polymer, to soldiers who learned the hard way that survival requires innovation. Katerina Volkov's crazy modification wasn't crazy at all. It was the sanest thing anyone did that winter. If you found this story compelling, subscribe to explore more untold stories of innovation under fire. The soldiers, scientists, and ordinary people who changed history by refusing to accept that good enough was good enough. Their stories deserve to be remembered. Their innovations deserve to be celebrated, and their sacrifices should never be forgotten.